Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of It's Not All Rainbows. I'm your host, Lindsay Goodman. I'm a certified trauma recovery coach, and I'm also a survivor of abuse in a queer relationship. I'm here to help validate and support those who are or have been in my shoes and to help spread awareness of what these kinds of relationships can look like. Today, I have a special guest with me. I have Andrew Campbell with me, who I found on Twitter. I'm fairly new on Twitter and really happy that I'm over there because I've found some really amazing folks over there who are talking about really important things. And Andrew really caught my eye because he does a lot of talking about abuse and how animals and children are affected and used as pawns and all of those things. So, Andrew is here today. Do you want to go ahead and give us a little background about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. And thank you again for all that you do in this field, in this area. Very important work. And thank you for the opportunity to join you today. An honor and a privilege I've been looking forward to. So my name is Andrew Campbell, and I'm the CEO and founder of Campbell Research and Consulting, based in Indianapolis, Indiana. I would say my work focuses primarily on prevention, but then also detection and intervention regarding family violence. And so when I say family violence, I'm talking abuse and harm that occurs in the home. It can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. Usually we're kind of thinking partner abuse, child abuse, pet abuse, elder abuse. Again, abuse, harm that occurs in the home and affects the family unit. One of the reasons I talk about family violence and use that kind of terminology is because, my belief is if you abuse one in the home, you harm all in the home. So, even if a child obviously in the house is not the direct target of the partner abuse, if they're living in that environment, they're still harmed by it. And so I think it helps when we think about these issues in that manner. Perps can't pick and choose who's hurt and harmed by their acts. Unfortunately, the reality is everyone in the home is impacted and affected. I focus often, as you said, on the pet piece because it was my dog who saved my life. I'm a published researcher, author, and educator in this field. I present often. I speak on average about 40 times a year at professional conferences. I publish often. I write, like I said, academic articles, wrote the book that we're talking about a little bit today. I've also written for USA Today and other types of media. But again, the drive and the passion for why I do what I do is personal experience. I can remember waking up around 14 or 15 to one morning in particular to my mom screaming, crying out in my room. It certainly wasn't the first event, but it was kind of a culmination for me. For a long time, I had been aware, being able to hear through my parents' wall there. It's hard because when you're 12, 13, 14, you're not really sure to call it partner abuse. You're not really sure, the terminology there. And I kind of think I thought of it as being more like my dad was bullying my mom. My dad was being mean to my mom. At a certain point, though, it switched over from me feeling sorry for her to me feeling scared for her. And so when this morning that I'm describing in particular happened, it kind of explains what I did next. So I remember my dad left that day. I helped my mom up and I said, hey, if you will not let him back in this house, we'll figure it out. I had a younger sister. But again, even at that age, 14, 15, I could see what emotional abuse does. And again, in my house, it wasn't physical or sexual abuse that I was aware of. It was the emotional abuse that I was witnessing, hearing, and then seeing obviously come into play. But again, even at that age, before all this research I've done, I could see how harmful and hurtful and just the terrible effect that it has on people. My mom and sister and I did our best, from that day forward. My dad did come back for a brief period a couple years later. That did not last long. But again, I say that because that's where my passion comes from. Throughout all of that, I mean, again, just speaking quite transparently, as a kid in that position, it's awful. It's hard. Just because my dad left the home that day doesn't mean, and I say this often, just because the abuser leaves the house doesn't mean the risk of harm is over. It often just changes. So things didn't necessarily get, easy from that point on. And again, I contemplated suicide many times, but it was always my dog who saved me. I would sit out there with Shelby, who was a mixed breed terrier, late at night, all times of day, and he just provided, comfort that I can't even put into words. Some nights he would lick the tears from my eyes as I cried. Other nights he would stand watch at the edge of the yard, Like I said, I was very close to killing myself at one point, thought I was killing myself. And it was that dog. That's who I credit for the reason I'm still here today. So again, I look at each day differently now, and I'm thankful for each opportunity to talk about these things. Again, always remembering Shelby, the reason why I'm still here today to be able to talk about it.
Thank you for sharing that. I know, I mean, this is what you do, this is what you talk about. It's still, it's like a really vulnerable thing to, I mean, I'm thinking about like my own child and growing up, and there's this stigma about like coming from an abusive household and having an abusive parent, and it sticks with you. Or, when we have abusive partners, it's like this was, it's just it's yucky, and society looks at it like, whoa, wow, why did that happen and how did that happen? Like instead of looking at the abuser, the perpetrator, like it's really unfortunate that that perpetrator targeted you, or that you were an innocent child involved in it and stuff like that. So to be able to be here and knowing that, our stories are important, and even if one person is helped and one person realizes that this is happening to them, is an incredible thing. So thank you again for sharing that.
No, absolutely. Like I said, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these things. Not fun to talk about, but important to talk about.
Absolutely. So what are some ways that you talked about your pet helping you and supporting you through that time. I experienced a lot of, both my child and my dog being used against me to control me, to keep me around, to mess with my feelings and all that stuff. What are some ways that we see perpetrators using animals um, to harm their victim?
Yeah, so absolutely. Unfortunately, something I think we're seeing more and more frequently. When you look in the literature, in academic literature, it's unfortunately common. We see, particularly among women, many of them when they do enter a DV shelter, domestic violence shelter, describing that threats or actual perpetrated harm to their pets was something that perpetrators definitely used. Unfortunately, perpetrators don't play by the rules. They often go after those who are most vulnerable. And in many cases, children and pets are among the most vulnerable in the home, obviously. Again, it's one of the main reasons why I describe these issues and I focus on the idea of family violence, because just because it's what we would call partner abuse today doesn't mean it won't be a child or pet targeted tomorrow. Again, I think it's so important to view these family units as all sharing risk in these types of situations. One of the things I've noted in my own research, I've published a study in particular in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, where I explored, I utilized police data, police reports from the scene of intimate partner violence incidents. It was something like, I think it was over 9,000 reports that I looked at. And one of the things that quickly jumped out to me is when, and officers did ask every time they responded to the partner abuse or domestic violence incident, was pet abuse a part of it? Was pet abuse something that also occurred in the home? That when victims described yes, that was a part of it, risk across the board seemed to just skyrocket. We saw rates of strangulation, idea of living with daily fear you will be killed, other types of emotional abusive types of things. Again, the physical risk too, strangulation, and then also reported rates of rape or sexual assault, things like that. Essentially everything across the board seemed to go up when we talked about pet abuse being a part of it. So that's why I often describe when I'm working with police officers, other professionals in the field, if you're working with a family who is dealing with partner abuse, domestic violence, understanding if pet abuse is a piece of it is important to know. We're concerned about everyone who's dealing with these issues, but if you know that pet abuse is a piece, again, risk just goes through the roof, unfortunately. And again, I don't think it's just the adult and pet who have that risk. Obviously, children are always stuck in the middle. It's why I say, if a child lives in a home where partner abuse is occurring, 100% of them are emotionally harmed by it. There's no way in my estimation that a child can live in that type of environment and not feel it, not be hurt and harmed by it.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the things that I struggle with so much, is that, when I was in that situation, I was thinking that I was able to protect him. And I'm sure your mom did too. Like, oh, the kids don't see it, they don't understand it. I'm keeping them sheltered from it. But as you said, like when a parent is, they're emotionally unavailable, they're walking on eggshells, they're in this constant state of fog. Possibly things are being said or done in front of the child, even if, like, mine was really little. So it's like, well, again, at the time I didn't really understand what was going on, but being able to, um, I think I only really understood this when I started to see people talking about this. Dr. Emma Katz, there are a couple other people on Twitter who are talking specifically about children and how they're affected. And it's very hard to accept that, and to struggle with the guilt that comes with that. But as you said, this is the perpetrator, and the perpetrator is doing these things. And obviously it's very important to be here talking about these things, and like you mentioned, training first responders to be able to understand that when they come into a home, they can't just walk in and be like, there's no marks on this person. Look at the children, look at their behavior. A lot of times the children are, my child did become fearful of my abuser, and that is when I left. Once I realized that this little kiddo was scared, I left. And a lot of times, like for me with the dogs, it was like the dogs would hide when they were around. So really having people understand that, and other family members, other people, because as a society, we just don't understand what this looks like.
Absolutely. I mean, I sometimes and often actually say, kids speak in the language they know how to speak. And often before they can describe abuse or know to call it abuse, they speak out behaviorally. So they'll act out, they'll show you through their actions. Sometimes some of the things they're experiencing. Like I said, even myself as a teen, not really even knowing for sure what to call it, right? And I think that makes sense. Like when you're a kid, especially younger children, you're trying to process it. It's something that you shouldn't be trying to process, and that makes it so difficult to figure out, right? Because especially when it's between two trusted adults or two adults you should be able to trust, it just adds an extra layer. And again, I want to share, the story is not one of saying, when you grow up in these environments that, I mean, I don't know. I want to share it. I want to share it honestly, and it will be work, but it's not hopeless. And so when you grow up and you see these types of things, it doesn't mean that you can't, learn that that's not safe, that that's not healthy, and desire and want something else, and go on and find something else. It certainly makes it a lot harder. And again, it speaks to the importance of these conversations and of trainings, like you said. I've heard agencies, not as often now, but early on when I was doing these trainings, I can remember a couple times where a responder made a comment about a child being too young to be impacted, too young to be affected. We know, I give presentations on the topic of pregnant partner violence. The reality is, even before birth, the developing fetus is harmed and hurt when their mother experiences abuse. We call it the parental pathway of stress and harm there. So again, no child is too young to be impacted or affected. And so again, catching it as early as possible and helping them to understand this is not normal. It may look like normal because it's what you're living every day, but we want a better normal for you. So eventually they have to kind of unlearn normal and replace it with a healthier, safer normal. Again, not impossible, but it is a lot of work. But with the proper intervention and resources, we certainly see many kids coming from these environments and going on and not being abusive, not entering into abusive relationships and going on to do just great things out there.
Yeah. What are some of the resources that you would recommend for people who, like myself, I feel like with the awareness that I have, I've been able to do so much to help my son. He was very little, but like you said, even fetuses are affected by this. What are some of your favorite resources, your go-to resources that you're sharing with people when you're traveling, when you're, giving these presentations that moms or parents who are being abused can go to, so that they don't feel so alone, or so helpless? Because it's a very helpless feeling to be like, how could this happen to my child? And, how did I let this happen, and all of that stuff. So resources for mom to help with her own guilt, or parent help with their own guilt, and resources to help with the kids.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would start by saying, obviously, all fault and blame lies on the abuser. Unfortunately, we hear that often, the idea that a victim is somehow blamed because a child was exposed. I mean, but the purpose of one who is engaging in the abusive acts, all blame and fault lies on them. I think parents end up in a very difficult space often, right? Of trying to figure out how do I best protect my children, trying to understand how is it really affecting them, things like that. But again, I lay full blame on the abuser. Obviously, in these types of situations, they're the one who are creating these conditions that obviously are often extremely difficult to navigate. In terms of resources, on my website, campbellresearchandconsulting.com, I share all of my academic studies I make available there for free. So I wrote a book chapter on child emotional abuse. I've written multiple studies looking at how children are impacted by domestic violence. All those are available for free. And the nice thing about those is they're well supported in the literature. So there's hundreds of sources within each of those papers of additional sources on the same type of information that obviously I tracked down when I was writing those papers. Through that website, you can also find my contact and reach out by email. If you have specific questions or concerns that maybe I can better help connect to certain resources. I speak all over the U.S. and virtually in I think 7 countries or so far. And so again, looking at where you are can also help determine maybe some of the most appropriate resources there in your area. But anything again that can help with that understanding that obviously it's not your fault, it's the perpetrator's fault. But again, it's the situation we're in, and so how do we move forward in a way that's healthiest for the child, and understanding the way that the child has likely been affected obviously is a good starting point when we think about how to again look at reversing some of those processes that may have begun.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, man, it's such a yucky thing to be talking about, and yet, like I said, it's given me so much hope as someone who has, chosen to speak out about what I experienced, and realizing like how important this is and how misunderstood it is. And so yes, it's definitely given me hope to see people talking about this, and to feel less alone, which is why I asked you to come on here, because again, it's seeing the pet and the child aspect, which is so not talked about. It's like you said, it's mainly and again, I'm a queer person, and so I have 3 things that society tends to just kind of like overlook, because it's so much of it as a man abusing a woman, when in reality there's so much going on out there that, like you said, people think is completely normal. Um, so what are some of the things that this is just like my interest. You do trainings with like first responders.
Mhm.
What are some of
Yes.
the things that you are teaching them? Because one of the things that I feel the most passionate about is, if first responders just knew and understood this, how many lives could be saved? So that's something I'm very curious about.
I continue to obviously to push the pet piece. I mean, obviously, one of the things I tell them is that abuse like this can happen in any relationship. In any type of in terms of sex of perp, sex of a victim, in terms of same-sex relationships, these things occur in any relationship. They can. Any type of home, any income levels. Again, we see them happening everywhere, all over the place. And so again, the idea that these things can happen anywhere. When I'm looking at specific things, I really am locked in on the pet piece as being a pretty important indicator. Again, when I'm working with first responders, I'm usually saying you should know about pets, and if it's a part of the abuse. And I usually tell them to ask it among their first 5 questions, just knowing that risk escalates so much, not just for the family unit, but for the responder as well. And again, one of my papers that explored that noted that even first responders seem to share an increased risk when responding to domestic violence, when pet abuse was an aspect of the violence or abuse in the home. Perps were more likely to abuse a substance, to have mental illness, to have access to a weapon, and to have used a weapon against their partner if pet abuse was a piece. We know that 20% of all domestic violence homicide victims are not the intimate partner, but a first responder, a bystander, a family member. So again, knowing that they already share a lot of risk there when they're responding, it's one of the riskiest calls an officer can get, is responding to partner abuse. And so again, knowing the pet piece elevates risk for them has been something I've found success in helping them to see that and understand that. Again, you want to ask about the pet piece, not just, well, I mean, obviously we're concerned about the family, but not just that. I mean, I mean, you want to go home to your family too, and understanding that your risk is probably elevated if that's a piece and component. There's just something about that pet piece. I know when I hear from, or what I've understood from perps is sometimes, not always, but sometimes they move to targeting pets and children when they feel like they're losing grip, when they're losing control. And again, it's not real control. Perps call it control, but obviously, when I think of perpetration of abuse, it's not an act of control as I see it. It's an act of weakness. It's revealing weakness. It's not showing power. It's not showing control. But they have it, twisted. They think of it as control, power. And when they feel they're losing that grip, we hear that often, that's when they start targeting children and pets. So even knowing that piece is occurring can potentially indicate that the abuse may be further along. And we know abuse only increases in severity and frequency. So even looking at it from those angles, I think has been helpful in helping officers understand. Again, we're still worried if pet abuse isn't a part of it, but if knowing that piece is there, our concern should be extremely high for everyone in that home and family unit.
I definitely noticed that like you said, the shift of the power target as I was realizing what was going on became more targeted towards the kid and the animal. Not necessarily physically, but like you said, all abuse is abuse and all of it is horrendous and should not be happening at all. Um, and as someone who was in it, and it's very confusing while you're in it, seeing it done to innocent, like we think, like, oh, I'm not innocent because I'm in the relationship too, and they've convinced you that you're toxic and all of that stuff, but then you're looking at these innocent little beings and you're like, wait a minute, this makes no sense. And like you said, it's always going to escalate versus de-escalate. What do you recommend for police officers if they come into a home where the abuser is there and the abuser is calm? And something that I'm thinking about is the Gabby Petito case. And we don't have to get like really into that, but when they show up and the victim is distraught and the abuser is calm and level-headed in dealing with them, do you train them on kind of what that looks like and how to spot that this is actually being twisted for them?
So interestingly, interestingly that you bring that up, one of my studies, I think it was an academic, it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. I think it was just an academic paper, but I looked at the same data I described earlier. It was titled "Behind the Mask," and I looked at how police officers described offenders on scene. And interestingly, though, the perps that I would indicate as being highest risk, and again, I suppose I hate to say highest risk because any incident can turn fatal with the next occurrence. And we also know that, emotional abuse, though, sometimes we see people incorrectly discounting it. I think if emotional abuse isn't abuse, then the brain isn't part of the body, because it so directly and clearly impacts the brain, which is fairly important. But anyway, one of the things that I noted is among highest risk for at least physical injury and harm, highest risk perps, was that they were actually statistically significantly more likely to appear calm, apologetic, and crying on scene than those that seem to present less risk. So it's something that I've worked hard to talk about, is that don't trust what you're seeing in front of you. Many of these perpetrators, particularly when we think about emotional abuse, they're pretty good at flipping the switch. They'll be one thing in their community and something altogether different in their home. We can think of many accounts and stories of that, and we know that to be true. And so again, something I certainly lock in on and say, yeah, you might have someone crying in front of you. They might be saying they're sorry, but don't trust that. Again, I trust what the case is showing you, what the information is. Also understanding that if the perp is there on scene, that victim is probably going to be very they may immediately start backtracking. They're taking a great risk by describing what's occurring in the home, especially in the presence of the perpetrator. I think the same with children. Unfortunately, I've heard of still several states in the U.S. In terms of child services, where they will ask children if they're being abused in front of the potential perpetrator. Again, it just makes no sense in my mind, to do that, because you've just dramatically increased risk. If the child defies all odds and still trusts you and says that in front of them, again, if you don't take appropriate action to protect them, if you send them home with that individual or leave the house and all individuals are still there, risk is only dramatically escalated. So again, it's certainly something that I talk often about in my trainings, this idea of don't necessarily trust the emotional outpouring you're seeing. Um, recognize that many of these perps are pretty good play actors and can turn that on with a switch. And as soon as you leave, it may be something altogether different.
Absolutely. That's so important. Um, what about, and now I kind of am thinking about Gabby. What about the fact that they sort of saw her as the aggressor because he had some marks on his body? Um, and you know, I mean, I don't know everything about that case, and I am using a very specific example because a lot of us know about that. But when, for example, you have someone who has been, we now know, abused in multiple ways, surely, and they have they have laid their hand on this person for whatever reason, and now they are being seen as the primary aggressor. What do you tell them in that case? Maybe the person who's being abused, threw something and that person says, oh, well, they threw this at me. And now the police are like, well, they're the aggressor. What do you tell them about that? And how do they, like you said, to tell them, to not trust what you're seeing, but how do they separate this and not fall for this thing that society is just like in love with, is that abuse is mutual and that they're both toxic and, well, she lashed out and did this thing. So, this person did that. How do you get past that?
Unfortunately, it's not an easy answer at all. Obviously, all of these situations are different. Unfortunately, at the core root of it is abusive acts, which in any case, abuse in any form and in any manner is obviously wrong and it's harmful. Again, I think it speaks to earlier detection and improving those types of things. I know I do hear that, and I hear agencies describe it where an individual maybe acts in a retaliatory manner, but still commits an act like that. And certainly, when we're thinking about it from a law enforcement perspective, a legal perspective, in terms of how those agencies work, it's very difficult and confusing for them to try to sort that out. How do you decide, especially when you're standing there in the situation, trying to figure out who started this, what? And again, I think sometimes we do see the mutual ideas as being a way to kind of I'm not saying that wash your hands of the matter, but just to kind of tie it up nicely and say, well, it's mutual, both, but again, I don't think that's the right response either. Like I said, I wish I had an easy answer. Those situations are very difficult, and each one has to be looked at differently to fully understand why the acts occurred. Was the retaliatory act or something like what you described, was it in defense, like to protect oneself? Because again, you might throw something at someone or take an act because they're coming at you, and then you feel in that moment that that's the best way to protect yourself. Understanding those types of things. Another key report source that we don't see speak up often that I think could be very helpful in those types of situations are neighbors. Neighbors only report about 8% of domestic violence, only 12% of child abuse. I think many times neighbors do have information. I can think of one case in particular that falls right in line with what you're describing. My understanding of the case, at least in this particular instance, was that the perpetration, in this particular case, it was a female who was the victim, the male perpetrator. The female was actually taken out on a stretcher, significant injury. A neighbor apparently had seen through a window the male push her down the stairs, it looked like, late at night. The next day, it's actually when the female was discharged from the hospital, she was actually the one getting arrested, which seemed a little confusing. The neighbor followed up and found out that the male then, before she could claim domestic violence, that he said, showed marks on his arms and said that he had hurt her. I think when the case was all sorted out, my understanding was maybe it was better understood that maybe those marks came from her trying to grab a hold of him so as not to fall down the stairs. So sometimes I think neighbors can have key information, especially when we think of a more urban setting. They're in close proximity. They often, I think, don't feel comfortable sharing, and maybe some of that is concern for risk to their own family, right? Many times these perps are scary, and especially when they're acting in such violent manners. The last thing you want is that perp to then turn on you and your family. So understanding maybe some of the reasons why neighbors don't talk about these things could be helpful, and including them in investigations. I'll add that while they don't typically report child abuse or partner abuse, they do report animal cruelty. So while only 8% of domestic violence reports come from a neighbor, 12% of child abuse, 89% of animal cruelty reports come from a neighbor. So neighbors will talk about pets. So again, it's another key aspect. I always come back to that pet piece because I do think it's important. For whatever reason, maybe it's because pets are outside more, there's better opportunity to detect, but neighbors will talk about pets. So I often work with animal control and say, hey, if you've got a neighbor reporting abuse of an animal, go ahead and ask them about adults and children in that home too, because again, it might be our best and only chance to get some pretty important information from neighbors who might help us with timelines and things like that when we're trying to figure out those situations.
Wow. You are saying a lot of things that I just had not thought about. A lot of the things that you have in your studies and research and things like that, that I just, again, I never thought about it, and I never realized um were so the statistics that you're sharing are, they're just mind-boggling and so important, and so I'm so thankful that you're doing this work and sharing it. Do you have any advice, or what would you say to neighbors or people who might witness things, who might be scared to come forward, something that might, because their fear is absolutely valid, and um but we are also noticing there, I noticed that there are a lot of people who maybe they're not necessarily in fear for their own safety, but they still will choose to stay neutral or stay out of it. What are some things that they could consider when it comes to sharing or not sharing?
I think the idea of making them feel safe, again, that responsibility lies on the agencies that make up our communities that deal with these types of things. With neighbors or anyone in the community needs to be able to trust responding agencies. They need to feel that if they make an anonymous report, that it truly will be kept anonymous, that there won't be some easy way. Again, I think one of the tricks when we're talking about a neighbor is you're so close, you're right there, you're often right next to the person, and so then again, this idea that they won't know, I think is a major issue. But in terms of weighing that risk, again, understanding that these things only get worse. The abuse and violence, particularly as it's perpetrated in the home and in these types of cases, doesn't just go away. Sometimes I hear the idea that I speak often again about family violence in all different types of areas and different types of presentations. And one of the ones I give talks about how family violence always increases after a natural disaster. I also speak often about how it's increased during and it's at the early stages and still ongoing during the pandemic. And sometimes we hear individuals say, well, they kind of blame the event on and for the family violence and say, well, once things settle back down after the natural disaster, the abuse will stop. Once we get out of the pandemic and things return to normal, abuse will stop. Nothing in the literature to support that it just goes away. Actually, and when we look at natural disasters, abuse always seems to increase, and that increase stays for years and often becomes the new normal. So again, it's only going to get worse. So if you're seeing something and thinking, well, I don't need to say anything, I'm sure they'll work it out. Not usually. Work it out usually means that someone gets significantly or even further harmed. And again, if you're talking about a child in the home, any exposure to abuse is too much. One of my other studies noted that on average, if law enforcement gets a call reporting domestic violence, and before the pandemic, it was estimated that only 1 in 4 victims of like physical or sexual partner abuse ever call law enforcement. But among those who do, on average, there have already been 10 incidents in the home before they make that call. So again, if you're seeing something happen, it's probably not the only time it's happened. It's probably happened a whole lot of times. And again, if you're thinking of children in that home, each occurrence, each incident is not only risk to them, but harm to them. So even thinking of it from that perspective, obviously we want to protect adults. But again, if you're worried about others in the home, children and pets certainly share that risk. And by turning a blind eye, again, you're leaving something to chance that is very scary, because there's no guarantee that they'll still be breathing or okay, whatever that looks like tomorrow.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that, it sounds so harsh, and we see I'm on like all the social media, and we see people making videos joking about killing their partner. And a lot of people, they'll say, oh, it's just a joke, it's just a joke. But we're out here saying, no, absolutely, like, we know that the odds of being murdered are, what is it, like 800% more if they have put their hands on your neck one time. I don't know if that's the exact statistic on it, maybe you know, but it's not, it is, people are like, why are you out here saying that so harshly? Like what you just said is like, they might not be breathing tomorrow, because it is the reality. It's and like you said, the same with pets and children. It is the reality when we're seeing these things, when we're witnessing it. It's definitely not the first time. I mean, it could be, but the odds are that it's not the first time. Um, Another thing that I noticed that I think that in general society does not understand is exactly what abuse is. And it isn't just, we think, just based on what we see like on TV, that it's, you're in the hospital, you're in the hospital, or you're covered in, like, Goodbye Earl by the Chicks, where, oh, she has a black eye, she has to cover it up, and that's just what we think of. Or of course we think of rape, and it's like society says these are the two things that we'll start paying attention to, but everything else that people are talking about, emotional abuse, financial abuse, now we have digital abuse, that's sort of really looked at as tolerable, like maybe not ideal, but like a lot of people are toxic these days, or, oh, my parents, they would call each other names, they would do this and they would do that. But we all need to really take it upon ourselves to research and understand. We don't have to write papers, and we don't have to um, make content, and we don't have to do anything, but to know and understand what abuse is and what it looks like is just so important. And if we as a society could understand and agree, accept that these things are abuse, um, versus kicking back. I do see a lot of kickback, of people saying, well, that's not abuse, or I've seen worse, and things like that. Um, I think that would be just a basic start for all of us.
Absolutely, I agree. Like you said, I mean, obviously, certainly not discounting. I mean, abuse in any form is awful, intolerable, wrong. Abuse in any amount, and there's no excuse for abuse. I mean, all those things I believe to be true. I do think, again, emotional abuse is discredited often, but it shouldn't be. And again, I say it carefully because I'm not saying this is always the case, but and many times, while a fracture will heal and a bruise will fade, it's the emotional abuse that lingers. And every act of physical abuse and sexual abuse also, in my opinion, includes emotional abuse. I don't know how it could not. And then we also see emotional abuse occurring on its own. It's often that emotional psychological harm that lingers. It'll linger for a lifetime for many people, and sometimes longer, as we think about being passed on to other generations. So certainly well past time that it's taken more seriously, and better understood, that it is abuse, and that the people who experience it, it's not, again, it's not weakness being victimized by it, it's weakness to perpetrate it. And as I said, there's no excuse for it. Even being a victim yourself doesn't excuse those acts. Again, when we think about some of those things, it might help us in terms of working with the perpetrator to better understand how to address the issues. But it's certainly, there's nothing that excuses it. And again, its impact and its effects are long term. If I can add another piece about the pets, and kind of more of a positive angle when we talk about the pet piece, I see pets being such a critical component in the healing process from emotional abuse. I talked about Shelby and how he saved my life. The reality is, for so many humans, if you're abused by humans, you're going to struggle to trust other humans. Many times a non-human animal, or, and we think of it as pets, but it's not always what we traditionally call a pet. I think in more rural environments, I can remember one child saying they couldn't wait to get off the school bus and run to the cow on their farm and tell the cow everything that they experienced. I think of other animals that we don't traditionally think of as pets filling that role. It's a support role. It's in children in particular, where partner abuse occurs, it's probably unlikely they're going to form a strong, secure attachment to an abuser. And the reality is the victimized parent may have had so much taken from them, they just have little to give. And so I think we're seeing more and more of this idea of pet attachment, where children strongly attached to animals in the home. Again, when that relationship is healthy, it can be life-saving for children, for animals too. Unfortunately, something we have to be careful about is that children don't replicate the acts of abuse they see in the house toward that animal. Obviously, we know that takes things a very different direction, but as long as that relationship is safe, healthy, and protected, again, we can see pets providing life-saving support. Now, it's not a permanent fix. Obviously, pets aren't going to live forever, but it can certainly help children get through very difficult times, and it's certainly something we have to understand. If we're working with these family units, we have to view pets as part of the family and understand they are probably, in many cases, the most important part of the family to some of these victims of abuse, particularly when they're their sole source of emotional support, consistency, and love, and things that are so critical to our emotional health and well-being.
Absolutely. I'm an adult, but I'm very thankful for my dog who was with me, during half of the abusive relationship. And I'm lucky that I have her, and I'm lucky that she's here, and she's just such a solid part of the family. So I definitely feel, her love and support, really. And so very, very, very important aspect of all of this. Like you said, there's the scary part of it that we need to be aware of, that these things can happen, and then this silver lining that can be there in terms of healing is that animals of any form can be an incredible healing resource for us. On that note, I feel pretty good about this conversation. We've talked about a lot of really important, also really yucky things. Um, and I really appreciate you coming on here and just for everything that you do. I'm very honored to have had you, and happy to be following you and supporting your mission. Before we go, is there anything, any last things that you want to share?
Not really. I mean, again, I just appreciate the time and the opportunity. Like I said, I speak often on these issues, but each one, I think it's important. I obviously, like I said, I research and I've done a lot of other things in this area, but it's been part of healing for me too, to be able to talk about these things, and a way to kind of look back and think about some not fun times in my life, and how now the opportunity to try to use those to help others is certainly something that, in a weird way, I'm thankful for. Not thankful for the harm, but thankful for the opportunity to try to help others. And so again, I echo what you said in terms of I'm thankful for the work that you're doing as well. It's important, very important, and again, I thank you for the opportunity. To, again, maybe someday if abuse will ever go away, then we can have conversations that are just about fun things. But for as long as it's here, there's things to talk about in this area. And again, like I said, I will say on that line too, something that sounds crazy, but it's true. I mean, if abuse is preventable, then ending it is possible. And so I think when we think of it from that aspect, again, there's a lot of work to do to get there. But again, I think any amount is too much. And that's why when I'm describing working in this field and in this area, I describe working to end abuse. Because again, I know it sounds like something that's so far, but it's true. If we can prevent it, we can end it. And so I think the work that you're doing, and that so many people out there raising awareness and talking about these issues and bringing them to the forefront, it's important. I'm just thankful to play the small part in it that I'm able to play in whatever way I can.
Well, thank you so much. Really quick before we go, would you mind sharing your website again so that anyone who wants to learn more about you and what you do can find you there?
Yeah, so my website is campbellresearchandconsulting.com. It's Campbell, CAMPBELL, and then researchandconsulting.com. All of my studies are there. The only literature that I've written that's not there is my book, which is called Not Without My Pet: Understanding the Relationships Between Victims of Domestic Violence and Their Pets. And you can find that on Amazon or most places where books are sold, paperback or an e-copy as well. And then obviously other ways to connect with me can be found at the website, through social media, through email, and things such as that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you everybody for listening. I will be back next week with more.
Thank you.